Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Air Force Association's annual Air Warfare Symposium in sunny Orlando, Florida. Our coverage here is sponsored by Leonardo DRS, and we're conducting our first interview at this show with Dave Deptula, who's a retired United States Air Force Lieutenant General, also the Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Dave, thanks very much on this very first day, just before the reception, to take some time to talk to us.
Yeah, you bet, Vago. Thanks. Great to be here.
Talk to us a little bit about your take on the administration's budget request, especially insofar as the Air Force is concerned. There's another healthy chunk of money that's going to be going into it, but there's also a concern. Adam Smith has expressed this. Even Rob Whitman, the chairman of Adam Smith, obviously the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, but even Rob Whitman, the chairman of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Committee, has expressed the same concern that this window of money may be a brief window. From your standpoint, is the Air Force spending its resources on the right priorities if it's only going to get, if it only may get a brief shot of big money?
Well, any increase is very, very welcome, given the paucity of resources that have been put into defense over the last several years. Clearly, the Air Force thinks that the distribution of resources is the appropriate one, and a lot of the money is going into improving readiness. So that's very, very welcome. Now, that said, you and your audience is very familiar with the geriatric status of the Air Force's force structure. You know, we've got bombers that are over 50 years old, not only just over 50 years old, but the youngest, B-52, is over 52 years old. We got trainers that are over 40 years. We got fighters that are over 30 years. And so we need to recapitalize our force. We need to start building more and more fifth-gen capability, because as the national security strategy so well points out, it shifted the focus away from very low intensity, the kinds of operations that we've been fighting over the last 2 decades, toward having to deal with peer competitors. So that means we need to buy, and we need to get there quickly in the context of upping, for example, the F-35 buy rate to beyond this very, very meager 48 a year, upwards of 110, 120, which was the original design requirement. That's what we need to do to get to the point where we'll be ready to take on near-peer competitors in the future.
How do you respond to those who are, including in the Air Force, who are looking to recapitalize and do some modernization of the fourth generation fleet? And, you know, if you look at it, there are a multiplicity of sort of new requirements, right? There is the low-end counterinsurgency aircraft. Air Force is pressing ahead on that requirement. There are some who've expressed a little bit of concern on that in terms of taking resources away from sort of the fifth generation aircraft. I think you're one of those folks. But talk to us about some of these muscle movements we're making. You know, the Joint STARS program is going to be completely restructured in terms of the recapitalization program as the commander of the Air Combat Command looks for something that's a more distributed architecture. Talk to us a little bit about each of these things, and are the resources, from your standpoint as the guy who was the ISR chief of the Air Force and the Intel chief of the Air Force, you know, are these things going into the right priorities from your standpoint to get us to that force that you know, the Air Force has been building toward, to be able to deal with these great power competitors in the 2020, 2025, 2030 timeframe?
Let me underline and put an exclamation point behind Chief Dave Goldfein's proposition that we shouldn't be buying new old. We need to be buying new. So, quite frankly, there is a balance here. You know, we're not going to need high-end forces in every conflict. Therefore, there's got to be a balance between affordability when you're conducting low-end operations, where you might not need the kind of penetrability and the linkages that are enabled by a next-generation combat cloud complex, if you will. So that's what the Air Force is wrestling with. On the one hand, on JSTARS, they have gone in the direction of, okay, we've got a lot of assets that can conduct GMTI. Why not network them? A lot of these assets have the ability to penetrate.
And GMTI is ground moving target indicator.
This is, it's a weird acronym, but it's essentially to be able to see and identify what's going on the ground. All weather, day, night, regardless of what the situation is. So being able to take a concept and move beyond the way we used to do business in the last century, capitalizing on the information age and exchanging information in a way that all can have access to that information, is where we need to be going. On the other hand, you don't necessarily need those complex systems in a lower intensity permissive airspace. So we're going to go through, the Air Force is going to go through this period of transition where it still holds on to the old E8s until the mid-2020s. And by that time, they will have mastered this ability to share information. So I think that's a good step. It is taking that step that moves us from old concepts of operations to new concepts of operations.
In your old job, I mean, during the Iraq War, we got very, very good, or the military forces got very good at stitching disparate pieces of information together to create these larger mosaics. The challenge with any of U.S. military systems is some of their core architectures are so old that the connecting of them becomes a challenge, whether it's missile defense networks, and each of the services has their own battle management systems that don't necessarily talk to other battle management systems. And I want to ask you about this. General Goldfein was ahead of the power curve in sort of calling for his highest priority was more airmen, but also a good multi-domain battle management system. The trouble is, each of the services is pressing ahead with their own battle management systems that don't seem to talk very well to everybody else's systems. Is this sort of a fundamental error as we're going through this? You know, when what's being done to ensure that each of the services is going to be able to seamlessly communicate with one another the way we need to in an interdependent future?
You put your finger on one of the biggest challenges. You're right. Each one of the services are developing inside their own service at two different levels of degree, the ability to ultimately share information in a seamless and ubiquitous fashion. That defines what I mean and refer to when I talk about combat cloud. We do need to stitch across the services. One of the challenges is the services don't fight. The services organize, train, and equip. The combatant commands fight. So everyone needs to agree on a common vision. I doubt we'll get to the point where everyone will agree on a common operating standard, but if we can agree on a common vision, then a common operating standard is not as important as the ability to share information across disparate systems. This is the essence of combat cloud, multi-domain command and control, and where all of that is headed. And I would commend you and your audience to read the paper that I wrote on combat cloud. If you go to the Mitchell Institute website, you can access it. It talks about this point. It's not advocating a particular solution. It talks about, well, let's at least agree on a common vision. Then each one of the services, it's not just the United States. We have to work with our coalition partners. So we have to be able to share information with our allies and our friends. And modern technology is allowing us to do that. It shouldn't be more expensive. It should actually be less expensive. You know, if you look at Moore's Law cycles, you know, the kinds of things that I'm talking about are equipping not just airplanes, but ships and surface vehicles and spacecraft with processing capability, with robust connectivity to be able to deal with anything that's thrown against them. But we got to expand our concept beyond just thinking about RF. We have to think about optical comms. We have to think about routing from space down to the ground, undersea, every possible venue to counter, because people say, well, look, all you're talking about is net-centric warfare. No, this is more than net-centric warfare on steroids. This is thinking about each one of those old platforms, whether they be an airplane, a ship, a tank, satellite, as information nodes in a much larger ISR, strike, maneuver, sustainment complex. And that's what our common vision needs to be.
And I should point out to our audience that one of the guys who was the leading thinker and actually developed and articulated and actually combat tested the combat cloud concept was Denis Mercier, general who was chief of the French Air Force, who's now Allied Command Transformation down in Norfolk.
And he gets it.
And he certainly does. And yes, it was a very, very good paper that you that you wrote. Let me ask you a little bit about the strategic surprise. I mean, everybody has been talking that in great power competition, especially with two nations like Russia and China, particularly China, on an ascendancy as opposed to just playing a limited set of cards well, that the United States should figure out how to deal with strategic surprise. Mark Kansian at CSIS released a report on strategic surprise, and they had an event that we've covered, and I commend folks to take a look at that video where Mark and Tom Mankin of Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments discussed this point. Talk to us a little bit about whether the Air Force that has worked very thoughtfully on a strategic level on all sorts of future potential eventualities. What are the best ways the United States can deal with strategic surprise, given that the world went to school on our capabilities? You were one of the architects of the Gulf War in 1990, 1991 in terms of the air strategy, along with John Warden, but also Buster Glosson and Chuck Horner. Talk to us a little bit about whether there's enough thinking from your standpoint on all of the potential things adversaries can do to get within our decision cycles, and whether we're thinking creatively enough to be able to get into our adversaries' decision cycle and disrupt it.
The short answer is yeah, there are people out there. Look, I just got back from a couple days at Air University, and I was enormously impressed with the young folks that are out there in the way that they're thinking about the kinds of challenges that you just laid out, so I'm not going to repeat those. Part of the challenge, quite frankly, right now is a sustained period of budget constraints that have got a lot of the leadership thinking only in the context of what's been given to them as a budget bogey. The budget bogeys, which are arbitrary, the Budget Control Act of 2011, for example, all those numbers, all those figures are arbitrary. They're not based on anything. We need to get to the point where we can articulate very well, and our leadership lays out, look, here's the national security requirements. This is what you want us to do. Here's what we need to be able to do that, unconstrained by these arbitrary budget limits that Congress keeps on imposing. And that's going to take a degree of fortitude in leadership because those numbers are much larger than what we have today. Look, we haven't dealt with a peer adversary in a long, long time. Perfect case in point is, he's got this paltry numbers in some particular force elements. And we don't think about attrition because we haven't had to deal with it in large numbers for a long period of time. Even in Desert Storm, the attrition numbers were a fraction of what we anticipated. Look, we only have 120 combat-capable F-22s. At any one time, you can only get about 30 of them airborne around the world. You think we might need more than that if we are faced with a two-peer competitor set of scenarios? So we've got to get beyond articulating that what we can afford is what we need. And quite frankly, I'm an advocate of going back, for having the Department of Defense go back to identifying a planning force based on what the actual warfighting requirements are, as well as a programming force. Today, and for the last 18 years, all we've dealt with is a programming force. And military folks and leaders who are determined to succeed with what they have then begin to believe that what they have is what they need. And that's not the case.
Last question. What are some of the key takeaways? What do you think the big messages that are going to be delivered here? What are you looking forward to hear and expect to hear from the Air Force leadership?
Well, this conference is very different than any other that the Air Force Association or the Air Force has participated in. It's focused on innovation. It's focused on new ideas. And I think you're going to be very surprised to hear some of the bright talent that exists inside the Air Force coming forward with some of the ideas that'll take us out of this institutional inertia that large organizations like the Department of Defense tend to get captured by, and get us beyond that sonic boundary, if you will, to get to the next step where we can actually capitalize on the potential of the information age.
Dave, thanks very much, and look forward to doing a recap with you before we head back to Washington.
Take care. Thank you, Vago. Much appreciated.